They accused me of being an unfit mother right there in court, dragging every mistake I ever made into the spotlight while my children watched in silence. But then my 8-year-old son stood up, asked to speak, and what he said next silenced the entire courtroom. My name is Poppy Hartwell, and 6 months ago, I stood in a courtroom that felt more like a coliseum. I wasn't fighting for my life, not in the way people usually mean it, but in the only way that's ever truly mattered to me. I was fighting for my children, not for money, not for revenge, just for the right to be their mother, to protect them, love them, and tuck them in every night without fear of them being taken away. I'm not telling this story because I want pity. I'm telling it because silence nearly cost me everything, and I've learned that the truth doesn't whisper. It survives by being spoken. I wasn't always this woman, standing in court, holding back tears, trying to appear composed while my world cracked open beneath me. Before all this, I was just someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone's mother, a quiet woman who loved too hard and questioned herself too often. When I met Jacob, I thought I was the lucky one. He was magnetic. That's the word I've always used. The kind of man who walks into a room and bends it toward him. Tall, confident, sharp, like he already knew he was going places and wouldn't apologize for it. He had an easy laugh, a practiced kindness, and just enough mystery to make you want to stay close. I was 24 when we met. He was 31, already working his way up at a marketing firm his family had a stake in. I was just out of nursing school, idealistic, a little naive, and, as my friends used to say, too willing to believe in happy endings. He noticed me at a charity event. Of all places, I'd volunteered for the free clinic, and he was one of the donors. I remember thinking how odd it was that a man in a $1,000 suit could speak so warmly to a girl in scrubs. We dated for a year, married within 2. For the first few years, I thought I'd won the lottery. We had a small house in the suburbs, a dog named Max, and Sunday mornings that smelled like cinnamon rolls and coffee. Jacob worked long hours, but I didn't mind. I believed in his dream. He used to say, "This is all for us, Poppy." And I believed him. Then our first child came, Ethan, and everything shifted. Motherhood changed me, not in the glamorous, glowing way people like to post on social media. It grounded me. It made my world smaller and richer, all at once. I found joy in the little things, folding his tiny onesies, recording his first laugh, watching the rise and fall of his chest when he slept. I had never loved anything so fiercely. But Jacob began to disappear. Not physically, at first, but emotionally. He started staying later at work, checking his phone during dinner, forgetting birthdays, small things that built up like sediment. When I brought it up, he'd smile that tight corporate smile and say I was overthinking again. He always made me feel like I was overreacting. Gaslighting wasn't a word I used back then. I just thought I was failing somehow, not keeping his attention, not being interesting enough. I tried harder. I kept the house spotless, lost the baby weight, laughed at his jokes, even when they felt cold. And when our second child, Ava, was born, I hoped, foolishly, that things would get better. They didn't. Instead, he grew colder, more impatient. His presence at home became a rare event. And when he was there, it felt like he was elsewhere entirely. I'd find unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, hotel receipts tucked into his suit jackets, and text messages that weren't meant for me. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just looked at me with that blank executive calm and said, "I'm not happy, Poppy. I haven't been for a long time." That was it. 10 years, 2 children. And he ended it like a quarterly report. He moved out 3 weeks later and into a downtown condo. I didn't ask who she was, the woman I was being traded in for, but I saw her on his Instagram 2 months later. Young, blonde, a personal trainer, I think. He never apologized. Not once. I went back to working nights at the hospital, long shifts on the pediatric floor. Ava was still in kindergarten, and Ethan had just turned 8. I tried to hold everything together, but every day felt like a balancing act with no net beneath me. Jacob, meanwhile, was thriving. Promotions, vacations, designer clothes for the kids when they visited him on weekends. He started bringing them to stay in his mother's mansion, the one with the marble floors and indoor pool. They'd come back talking about sushi, jet skis, and how fun Daddy's house was. At first, I didn't mind. I wanted them to have joy, even if it wasn't with me. But then I noticed the change. Ethan stopped hugging me when he came home. Ava clung to her tablet, avoiding eye contact. They began to compare everything. Their bedrooms, the food, even the toothpaste. One night, Ethan asked me why we always had poor people's cereal. It crushed me, because that night, dinner had been cereal. I'd gotten home late. The fridge was half empty. I had planned to cook something, but my body said no. So I poured 3 bowls of off-brand cornflakes, kissed them both on the forehead, and told them we'd have pancakes tomorrow. I didn't cry in front of them, but I did cry later, into a dish towel, while washing the same bowl 3 times just to keep my hands moving. And still, I never said a bad word about their father. Not once. I told them it was okay to love him. I told them he loved them too. I told them they didn't have to choose. But someone else was telling them the opposite. It started with little things. Ava telling me, "Daddy says you're always tired because you're lazy." Ethan saying, "Grandma says you only care about money." I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there, numb, mouth dry, stomach cold. His mother, Eleanor Hartwell, had never liked me. Not when we first met, not when we married, and certainly not now that I was no longer her perfect image of a wife. She was the kind of woman who gave compliments that sounded like threats, the kind who looked you up and down and smiled like she already knew your worth. And it wasn't much. She was rich, powerful, and cold as frostbite. And now she had an agenda. I found out through a letter, a formal one, from their family lawyer. They were suing for primary custody, not joint, not even alternate, full custody, on the grounds that I was emotionally unstable, financially unfit, and the one that made me laugh bitterly, prone to erratic behavior. Apparently, crying in public once after a night shift while pushing Ava on a swing had been caught on camera by a neighbor. That was their evidence. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter in my hand, staring at it while the kids played in the next room. I remember Ethan giggling, building a Lego tower. And I remember the sound of my heart thudding in my ears, loud and hollow. That's when I knew this wasn't about co-parenting anymore. It wasn't about what was best for the children. This was a war, and I was the only soldier on my side. But I wasn't going to lose. I wouldn't, because love, real love, doesn't come with designer toys and beach vacations. It comes with sleepless nights and scraped knees kissed better, with being there when the fever hits or the nightmares come, with showing up every single day. I may not have had marble floors or a pool, but I had love, and I had the truth, and I was ready to fight for both. The day Jacob officially left, not just in body, but in presence and spirit, in every quiet part of our home that once held echoes of a family that was trying to stay whole, was not marked by any dramatic confrontation, nor any shouting or broken furniture, but instead by an unbearable quiet that settled into the corners of the house like a fog that refused to lift. He didn't slam the door. He didn't even look me in the eye when he walked out with his leather duffel bag and the navy suit he always wore when he wanted to look like a man in control. No, what I remember most is the hollow click of the door closing and the way my reflection looked in the hallway mirror, tired, pale, not crying, not even blinking, just there like a ghost who hadn't realized she had died yet. He sent a text the night before. I'll be by tomorrow to grab my things. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder than it needs to be. As if uprooting our children's lives, walking away from a decade of marriage, and stepping out of fatherhood like it was a jacket that no longer fit was somehow meant to be simple. As if I was the one making it complicated by having the audacity to still feel something. When Ethan came home from school that afternoon, his backpack slightly unzipped and his shoelaces a tangled mess, he looked around the living room and instinctively sensed something was different, like children do, with their uncanny ability to read what adults try desperately to hide behind forced smiles and routine. "Where's Dad's coffee mug?" he asked, pointing to the empty spot beside the sink where Jacob always left it. It was a plain white mug, the one with the chipped rim and the fading print that read, "World's Best Boss," a joke from his office holiday party. But somehow, that silly, stained cup felt more like proof of Jacob's presence than any photo on the wall. I took a breath, crouched down, so we were eye level, and tucked a loose curl behind Ethan's ear before answering. "Daddy is going to be living in a different house now, sweetheart, but that doesn't change how much he loves you." Ethan didn't cry. He didn't even ask why. He just nodded slowly, the way a child does when they're trying to pretend they're not scared, and went upstairs without saying another word. And it was in that silence, not in the arguments, not in the lawyer letters that would come later, that I realized just how much my children had already learned to carry grief in silence. Ava, being only 5 at the time, didn't really understand. For her, the separation seemed more like a game, an adventure where Daddy's new apartment was a hotel and his visits were vacations. She would come back from his weekends with glitter in her hair, new toys in her backpack, and stories about pool days and pizza nights, and Miss Lacey, who apparently did the best hair braids, and let her eat marshmallows before dinner. I tried to smile when she talked about those weekends. I listened to every story. I laughed when she told me about the dog that wore sweaters and the robot vacuum that danced. I never once told her to stop talking about Jacob's world, even when it felt like a knife carving out space between us, because I refused to let her feel like she had to choose sides. I told myself over and over again that the best thing I could do as a mother was let her love freely, without boundaries shaped by my heartbreak. But children notice things. They notice when the light in your eyes dims. They notice when cereal replaces hot meals because payday is still 5 days away. They notice when you fall asleep sitting up, your shoes still on, and when your hands tremble just a little too long while you're packing their lunch. They noticed. One evening, after a particularly grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, I came home to find Ethan and Ava curled up on the couch, watching cartoons, the living room dim except for the flickering light of the screen. I dropped my bag, kicked off my shoes, and joined them, trying to act like I wasn't 2 minutes away from falling apart. Ava looked up at me and said, "Mommy, why don't we have a big TV like Daddy's house?" Ethan, without missing a beat, added, "And why don't we ever go to restaurants with cloth napkins?" It wasn't that they were ungrateful, they were just confused. They had been introduced to 2 realities, and the contrast between them was sharp and loud and constant. One world was polished, shiny, and filled with treats and toys and Disneyland promises. The other was real, raw, and sometimes exhausted, filled with late-night dinners, second-hand clothes, and a mother who loved them so deeply it ached. I told them we were saving up for something special. I told them cloth napkins were overrated. I told them the truth, but wrapped it in love because I knew their little hearts needed softness more than explanations. And still, with every passing week, I could feel them drifting, not in love, but in comfort and identity, in how they saw our home compared to the version Jacob had built to impress rather than to raise. But what broke me more than anything else was the moment Ethan came home and asked, "Mom, are we poor?" I don't remember what I said right away. I think I laughed. I think I made a joke about how rich we were in hugs. But later that night, after they were asleep, I sat on the kitchen floor next to the leaking sink, still in my scrubs, and cried so quietly I thought my ribs might break from holding it in. The truth was, I was drowning, not just in bills and fatigue, but in this invisible competition that Jacob had created, knowingly or not, where love was being measured in PlayStations and pool parties, where weekends at Dad's meant waffles and movie nights, while weekdays at Mom's meant rushed dinners, forgotten library books, and falling asleep to the hum of the dishwasher because it was the only thing keeping the house warm. And as if that weren't hard enough, the whispers began. At first, it was just subtle things. Jacob's mother, Eleanor, calling the children's school just to check in, asking if they'd noticed any unusual behavior at home. Then it was Jacob himself, texting me passive-aggressively, saying things like, "The kids mentioned you've been working a lot. Just wondering if they're getting enough attention," as if he hadn't stepped out of their lives and outsourced his parenting to weekly visits and a girlfriend with a Pinterest-perfect smile. And then there was Lacey, the picture-perfect interloper who suddenly started posting photos with my children, calling them my little loves in captions as if she had earned the right to those words, as if bedtime stories and hospital visits and first fevers meant nothing compared to an Instagram post at the zoo. I swallowed my anger over and over because I didn't want to be the bitter ex-wife. I didn't want to become the caricature that Jacob's family already believed I was. I kept showing up. I kept saying yes. I kept packing their bags for his weekends and smiling when they came home with souvenirs I couldn't afford to match. But behind closed doors, I was crumbling. I was working 16 days in a row, skipping meals so they wouldn't notice how tight the grocery budget had become, mending the same pair of Ethan's jeans 3 times because I didn't have money for new ones. And through it all, I still kissed them goodnight, still listened to their stories, still reminded them how much they were loved. And I thought, foolishly, that maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Until one day, I got a letter in the mail, thick, official-looking, with a return address from Jacob's attorney. They were filing for full custody, not shared, not joint, full. The reason? That I was emotionally unstable, financially incapable, and potentially damaging to the children's psychological development. I read those words 3 times before I realized I wasn't breathing. My hands trembled. My ears rang. I had spent every last ounce of myself giving these children everything I had. And now, the people who had watched from the sidelines while I built this life from the ground up were trying to take it all away. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, watching him breathe, listening to the soft sound of his dreams. And I made a vow not to fight out of anger, not to retaliate, not to stoop to their level, but to stand no matter how tired I was, no matter how alone I felt. Because the truth was on my side, and I was done being quiet. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't announce itself with yawns or drooping eyelids, but rather creeps into the body like smoke through a cracked window, silent, stubborn, and suffocating. It was the kind of exhaustion I wore every day, like an invisible layer of clothing stitched together from unpaid bills, long hospital shifts, and the quiet, ceaseless fear that somehow, despite everything I was doing, I was losing the people who mattered most to me, my children. Every morning started the same. I would rise before the sun, my body aching from too little sleep and too much worry, pad softly through the hallway so I wouldn't wake Ethan or Ava, and stare into the bathroom mirror, wondering how much longer I could continue pretending that I wasn't breaking. I'd tie my hair up into a bun, splash cold water on my face to banish the shadows beneath my eyes, and whisper to myself, not affirmations, not prayers, just the kind of low, desperate reminders mothers make when quitting isn't an option. One more day? I'd say, just get through one more day. Being a single mother isn't heroic in the way movies portray it. There are no stirring speeches, no grand declarations of strength. It's in the minutiae, in wiping down sticky counters while your feet throb from 12 hours on the hospital floor, in pretending you're not crying while folding laundry at midnight because the silence reminds you how loud your life used to be. It's in cooking dinner with whatever's left in the pantry and smiling when your daughter asks if tomorrow you can have the kind of chicken daddy makes with the lemon stuff, even though you know tomorrow's dinner will be cereal again. And yet, in all of that quiet wait, there was love, a messy, relentless, imperfect kind of love that kept me going when logic and reason would have given out. Because no matter how tired I was, no matter how unfair it felt, I still had them. Ethan with his thoughtful eyes and too old soul, Ava with her wild curls and relentless questions. They were my reason, my anchor, the only light left when everything else had grown dim. But as the custody battle loomed like a storm on the horizon, I started noticing how even that light was flickering. Jacob wasn't just petitioning for full custody. He was building a narrative brick by brick in a courtroom I hadn't even entered yet. And the people helping him weren't strangers. They were the ones who had once toasted our wedding, who had kissed Ethan's forehead in the delivery room, who had stood beside us during baptisms and birthdays and backyard barbecues. His family, the Hartwells, were powerful, not just in wealth, but in perception, in reputation, in the quiet authority that comes from generations of country clubs, exclusive schools, and polished smiles. To them, I had always been an outsider, a sweet girl from a working-class background who didn't quite fit the mold. I was tolerated, not embraced, respected, perhaps for my manners and my education, but never truly welcomed into their world. So when Jacob left, it was as if the gates of that world slammed shut behind him, and I and my children were no longer welcome on the other side. It started small, subtle. Eleanor Hartwell, Jacob's mother, began showing up at the kids' school with surprise visits, bearing gifts for the teachers, complimenting the staff, asking questions about how her poor grandbabies were coping with their mother's difficult situation. She'd tilt her head just enough, soften her voice just enough, and suddenly I was no longer a devoted mother trying to stay afloat. I was a liability. Then came her daughter, Claudia, Jacob's older sister, who sent me an email that masqueraded as concern but bled with condescension. "Poppy, I know things are hard for you right now." She wrote, "If you ever need someone to take the kids for a few weeks, just until you get your footing, we'd be happy to help. It might be better for everyone, especially the children." Better, as if love, presence, and sacrifice could be outbid by square footage and trust funds. I didn't respond. I couldn't, because what do you say to people who see your children as extensions of their legacy rather than beating hearts that wake up crying for you in the middle of the night? I buried myself in preparation. My lawyer, a kind but clearly overworked public advocate named Marianne, told me gently but directly that we had a tough case ahead. "They're not just filing for custody," she said, sliding the thick folder across the table. "They're filing with evidence. Evidence. Photos of our small home with the sagging porch. A teacher's report that mentioned Ethan's recent mood swings. A neighbor's complaint about Ava wandering into their yard unsupervised, even though I was 10 feet away, sitting on the stoop with her juice box in hand. They're painting you as overwhelmed," Marianne said, "as someone who means well but isn't coping." And I wanted to scream, not because it wasn't hard, but because I had never stopped coping. I had coped through abandonment. I had coped through nights without electricity. I had coped through tears I had to swallow for the sake of two fragile hearts that still believed love was forever. But now, none of that mattered. What mattered was perception. What mattered was money. What mattered was who could hire the better expert to say what kind of mother I was. And I was tired. So damn tired. One night, after a double shift, I came home to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out, a deep furrow in his brow. Mrs. Grant said I needed a parent's signature. He mumbled, sliding the paper toward me. It was an essay, a short one, just a few paragraphs about someone who inspires you. I expected a write-up about a basketball player or his favorite teacher. But it was about me. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't even spelled correctly in parts. But it said, "My mom is the strongest person I know because even when she is really tired and works all night, she still makes me pancakes and helps me when I cry. She never yells. She never leaves. She's always here, even when she's sad." I pressed my hand to my mouth and nodded, forcing a smile. "It's perfect," I whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Because in that moment, I realized something. The truth didn't have to shout. It just had to survive long enough to be heard. But survival, I was learning, was a fragile thing when the system was built for those with louder voices and deeper pockets. Every time I sat across from Marianne, she looked at me with sympathy, the kind that reminded me she had seen 1,000 women like me, good mothers, broken by the machine, exhausted by the process, drowning in the paperwork while the other side played golf with the judge's college roommate. Still, I showed up to every appointment. I wrote statements. I collected photos. I gathered letters from coworkers, teachers, neighbors who weren't trying to join the Hartwell Country Club. I built a case not with polish, but with persistence. And as the court date drew closer, the air in my lungs grew tighter. Jacob's visits became more sporadic, but flashier. He took the kids on day trips to amusement parks, bought them new backpacks and shoes and gadgets I couldn't even name. When Ethan returned home with a tablet and said, "Daddy said I can play this all I want because Mommy's house is boring," I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded, took the tablet, and set a timer. Because I wasn't going to fight fire with fire. I was going to fight it with truth. But even truth begins to shake under the weight of pressure. And as the court date finally arrived, and I stepped into that hallway outside the courtroom doors, holding Ava's tiny hand while Ethan stared at the floor in silence, I realized that no matter how much I had prepared, nothing could fully brace you for the moment when your worth as a mother is placed on trial for strangers to decide. The weight I carried wasn't just the fear of losing them. It was the guilt of not having more to give. It was the humiliation of being scrutinized while still carrying the scars of survival. It was the deep, aching question that I never spoke aloud but heard in every silence. What if love isn't enough? The morning of the custody hearing unfolded not with noise, but with a weighty, suffocating quiet that hung in the air like fog on a winter morning, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the judgment that would soon be passed not just on my parenting, but on the very heart of who I was as a mother, a woman, and a human being whose only crime was refusing to disappear. I woke long before dawn, well before the city stirred to life, and sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes in the half-light, staring down at my calloused hands and chipped nails, hands that had soothed fevers and tied shoelaces, and wiped away every single tear my children had ever cried, wondering if the court would see those hands the way my children did, as comfort, or whether they would be twisted into something unfit, unstable, unworthy. I dressed slowly, with a kind of reverence I had never before applied to anything I owned, selecting not what was flattering or elegant or fashionable, but what might project competence, steadiness, and the illusion that I was not quietly falling apart beneath the fabric. The blouse was a pale gray, wrinkle-free, neutral, forgettable, and the skirt was navy and modest, ending just below the knee, paired with flat black shoes that I had worn to more job interviews and funerals than I cared to count. There was no perfume, no jewelry, no boldness of any kind, because everything about me that morning had to whisper, not shout, and even then I knew that no matter how carefully I curated the version of myself that would appear before the court, it would still be filtered through the eyes of people who had already decided what they wanted to see. When I arrived at the courthouse, accompanied only by Marianne, who was carrying our carefully labeled evidence folder with the same grim focus as a surgeon preparing for an impossible operation, I immediately felt the chasm between my world and theirs. Across the hallway, Jacob stood dressed like a man who had never been undone by anything, his tailored charcoal suit untouched by anxiety, his hair styled with that same ruthless precision I used to find attractive, and his posture loose with the ease of someone who knew his money, his lineage, and his narrative would be more compelling than the tired, ordinary woman sitting across from him. Beside him, standing with the artificial poise of a woman auditioning for a role she hadn't earned, was Lacey, younger, shinier, rehearsed in all the ways I had once believed made a mother. And then, like a scene designed to humiliate me further, I noticed Eleanor and Claudia seated directly behind Jacob, draped in understated designer fabrics, their expressions solemn and calculated, as though they had come not to witness a hearing but to ensure a verdict, their eyes scanning me with the clinical detachment of surgeons evaluating a tumor before removal. When we entered the courtroom, the space felt cavernous, too large for the beating of my heart, which now echoed in my ears like a drum. I sat stiffly beside Marianne at the plaintiff's table, my children seated in the front row of the gallery under the watch of a court-appointed liaison, and though they were not permitted to speak, I could feel Ethan's gaze fixed on me, and even without looking directly at him, I knew what I would see: worry he was too young to name, love he didn't know how to protect, and a flicker of something stronger than fear that I wouldn't understand until later. The judge, a middle-aged man with weary eyes and a practiced frown, called the court to order, and almost immediately Jacob's attorney, a polished man with expensive cufflinks and a voice trained to sound objective, while hiding the venom laced in every word, stood to deliver their opening remarks. With an ease that made me feel invisible, he painted our home as chaotic, our life as erratic, and my role as mother as insufficient not due to lack of affection, which he graciously acknowledged, but because affection, as he so eloquently claimed, cannot compensate for inconsistency, financial strain, and the increasingly unstable emotional climate the children are being subjected to. What followed was a carefully choreographed assault on everything I had built, with witnesses who had only seen fragments of our lives, distorted, taken out of context, framed through the lens of those who wanted to take my children and call it rescue. Claudia spoke of my agitation at a family event, claiming she had witnessed Ava playing near the pool unattended, conveniently omitting the fact that I had been standing just feet away, crouched beside Ethan tying his shoe. Eleanor spoke next, her words delivered with chilling poise, describing how she had encouraged me to seek mental health support, a laughable distortion of what had actually been a thinly veiled thread over brunch, in which she told me, with her hand on her wine glass and a smile like frost, that she hoped I would do the right thing before the courts made the decision for me. They presented a psychological evaluation conducted by a professional who had visited our home once, unannounced, on a day when I had been awake for 36 hours straight due to a double shift, and a surprise fever Ava had developed the night before. His report described emotional fatigue, lack of visible enrichment activities, and a markedly strained maternal presence, which, when read aloud in the sterile echo of that courtroom, made me sound like a ghost instead of a mother doing everything in her power not to disappear. And then Jacob spoke, not like the man who had walked out on us without warning, not like the father who had traded bedtime stories for weekend theme parks, but like a hero carrying the burden of protecting his children from a situation he deeply regretted. His voice was low and full of manufactured grief, his eyes occasionally misting as he described how he had respected my role, but could no longer ignore the impact my circumstances were having on the children's development. He used words like concern, stability, future, wrapping his betrayal in a narrative so rehearsed it was indistinguishable from sincerity. And when he sat back down, I knew the courtroom didn't see a manipulator. They saw a savior. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood slowly, legs trembling beneath me, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of carrying this battle alone for so long, and I tried, with every word, to tell the truth, not just with facts, but with the ache and the conviction of someone who had nothing left to lose. I didn't cry, though my throat threatened to close, and I didn't plead because I knew that if I begged, they would see desperation rather than devotion. Instead, I spoke of Ethan's quiet strength, of Ava's unstoppable curiosity, of the bedtime songs and the dinners cobbled together with love, of the nights I sat awake folding laundry because it was the only time I had to breathe, of the games we invented when we had no toys, of the warmth and stability I built not from money, but from showing up every single day. I told them I was not perfect, that I was tired, flawed, human, but that my love was not fragile, and that the home I had created, though modest, was a sanctuary of consistency, of safety, and of truth. I placed photos on the evidence table. Ethan helping Ava with her homework. Ava asleep in my arms, all of us laughing in a blanket fort made of old sheets and fairy lights. And I told the court that while those images might not carry the weight of wealth, they carried the reality of a home rooted in love that does not waver based on court dates or bank balances. And just when I thought I had nothing left to defend, Jacob's lawyer stood again, flipping open a document I had never seen, and began reading aloud a private email, one I had written to myself months earlier in a moment of deep despair, a message I had typed but never sent, describing my fear, my rage, my helplessness, and my resentment toward a system I felt was swallowing me whole. Every raw sentence, written in pain and intended for no one, was now dissected in front of strangers, used as proof that I was unraveling, that my emotions made me dangerous, that my motherhood was a mask slipping. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just sat there, feeling myself unravel, watching my words, my most vulnerable confessions, turned against me with surgical precision. And then, in the silence that followed, in the aching space left behind after my dignity had been dissected and my heart laid bare, a voice broke through, soft, clear, trembling, but certain. "Your Honor," it said, "can I say something?" And in that moment, everything stopped. There are moments in life when time doesn't just slow, it stretches, it holds its breath, it bends around a truth so fragile and so monumental that you can feel the world tipping toward it. That was what happened in that courtroom the moment my son, my 8-year-old Ethan, stood up from his seat in the gallery, his small hands clenched into nervous fists, his eyes focused not on his father or his grandmother or the judge, but directly on me, as if somehow in the midst of all the noise and cruelty and formality, he still saw the only thing that had ever truly mattered, the woman who had loved him with every exhausted cell in her body, the woman who had refused to disappear even when the world told her to stay quiet and broken. The judge blinked, caught off guard by the voice, by the weight of the silence that followed it, and asked again, this time with gentleness not usually afforded to courtroom procedure, "Ethan, are you sure you want to speak?" Ethan nodded, not with bravado or defiance, but with the calm steadiness of a child who had spent far too long listening to adults speak over him, around him, through him, and had finally decided it was time someone listened to him. The judge, pausing to glance at the attorneys on both sides, finally motioned toward the bailiff and said, "Very well, bring the child forward." I didn't move. I couldn't. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles ached, my chest rising and falling with a tremor I couldn't contain. I wanted to stand, to shield him, to wrap my arms around him and tell him it wasn't his burden to carry, that no child should have to speak truths in a room full of people who only valued leverage, but something in his expression told me that if I stopped him now, I would be taking away the one thing none of us had given him through this entire nightmare, his voice. Ethan walked slowly to the front, climbing the 2 small steps to the witness box, and sat down with his feet swinging just above the floor, his shoulders squared not in defiance, but in clarity, in quiet bravery. He looked small beneath the high wood of the stand, but not weak. He looked young, but not uncertain. And when the judge gently asked him if he understood the importance of telling the truth, he nodded again and replied, "Yes, sir, I do." What came next wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't coached or guided or filtered. It was raw, vulnerable, and so heartbreakingly pure that the entire room seemed to lean forward, as if drawn by gravity to the sound of a truth that no adult in that courtroom had been brave enough to speak. "My mom is not perfect," Ethan began, his voice wavering only slightly before it steadied again. "She forgets things sometimes, and sometimes she's tired. Sometimes we have cereal for dinner, and once she cried because the sink broke and the repairman said it would cost too much. But my mom never, ever forgets to hug us. She never forgets to make us laugh, even when she's sad. She always wakes me up for school, even if she just got home from work, and when I had a bad dream, she stayed up all night with me and read stories until I fell asleep again." There was a rustle in the courtroom, a stifled breath here, a shuffled paper there, but no one dared interrupt, not even Jacob. "She tells me I can love both her and Dad," Ethan continued, his eyes drifting briefly toward his father before returning to the judge. "She says it's okay, that I don't have to choose. But Daddy says different stuff. He says Mom is mad all the time. He says she doesn't want us to have fun. He says if I told the judge that I want to live with him, I can get a PlayStation, and I won't have to eat eggs for dinner anymore. But I like eggs sometimes, and I don't care about PlayStations if it means I don't get to see Mom." My throat tightened so hard I thought I might choke on the ache that rose from my stomach to my chest. I pressed both hands against my mouth, willing myself not to sob aloud because I didn't want to take this moment from him. He wasn't doing this for show. He was doing this because something inside him, some fierce, intuitive thread of love, had refused to stay silent. "Daddy says stuff at his house that makes me feel weird," Ethan went on, his voice smaller now but no less clear. "He says not to talk about Mom, especially not to Lacey, and that if Ava and I miss her too much, we should just get used to it. But when we come back to Mom's house, it's okay to talk about Dad. Mom never gets mad. She just listens. She lets us talk. She lets us cry. And she always tells us we don't have to be scared of loving anybody." He paused then, and the silence that followed was so deep, it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. "I don't want to stop living with my mom," he said, "because she's my home, and I don't want her to be sad anymore. She tries so hard. I just want her to know she's doing good." The judge leaned forward slowly, folding his hands, and though his face remained neutral, there was something different in his posture, a heaviness, a reverence, a dawning recognition that this child, in his simplicity and sincerity, had just unraveled hours of weaponized arguments with a single, unshakable truth. Love, when it is real, does not demand proof through gifts or leverage. It simply shows up again and again, even when it is exhausted and afraid. Jacob's lawyer began to stand, mouth half open, ready to object or reframe or reclaim the narrative, but the judge raised one hand, firm and final, and the lawyer sat back down without a word. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as though we had all just watched something sacred take place. And I, still seated at the table, hands over my mouth, heart breaking open not in sorrow but in something closer to awe, realized that my son, the little boy I had worried was drifting away from me, had just fought for me in a way no adult had dared to do. Not because I asked him, not because I needed him to, but because he knew in his bones that the truth had to be spoken, and he was the only one in the room brave enough to do it without armor. The judge called for a short recess, and as the courtroom slowly emptied, I stood on shaking legs and met Ethan halfway, my arms pulling him into the tightest, most trembling embrace I had ever given. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just held on, tight, like he had been waiting for permission to exhale, like he was reminding me that no matter what the court decided, the bond between us could not be severed by lawyers or lies or people who had never wiped away his tears. When we returned from recess, the judge's voice was firmer, more resolved as he addressed the court and delivered a ruling that would echo in my memory for the rest of my life. He stated in no uncertain terms that while wealth and resources were important, They were never to be considered replacements for consistency, emotional presence, and a demonstrated history of love. He acknowledged that both parties cared for the children, but that one had clearly engaged in manipulation and coercive tactics, subtle or not, which posed emotional risk to the children's development. He granted me primary custody. He implemented conditions on Jacob's visitation rights, including mandatory co-parenting, counseling, and supervision for the first 3 months of visitation transitions. And then, as if speaking to the room more than just the record, he added, "Sometimes, in these rooms, we forget to listen to the quietest voices, and yet, more often than not, they are the ones speaking the clearest truth." The gavel struck once, not with fury, but with finality. It was done. The courtroom emptied slowly, but I didn't move. Not right away. I sat, Ethan beside me, Ava climbing into my lap, and for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel. Safety, not just in legal terms, but in the knowledge that I had not failed them, that love, real, raw, imperfect love, had been seen, had been heard, had been believed.